August 19th, 1944. The rain hammered against the metal skin of the B-24 Liberator as Lieutenant Jay LeVan pushed the throttles forward into the monsoon darkness. Inside the nose compartment, Bombardier Lieutenant William Shytle hunched over a small green radar scope, watching phosphorescent blips materialize through the storm. Somewhere out there in the South China Sea, invisible beneath clouds and rain and the absolute blackness of a moonless tropical night, a Japanese heavy cruiser was running supplies to enemy garrisons. The cruiser's captain believed the weather made him invincible. He believed no American bomber could find him in this darkness, let alone attack him with any accuracy. He believed the laws of physics and the limitations of human vision protected his ship as surely as its armor plating. He was about to discover he was catastrophically wrong. LeVan's B-24 carried a weapon system that should not have existed, a combination of technologies so classified that even discussing it outside designated secure facilities could result in court-martial. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The radar in Shytle's nose compartment was mated to a modified Norden bomb sight through an analog computer that performed continuous ballistic calculations. Together, these systems allowed a bombardier to attack with precision in total darkness, from an altitude of just 100 feet above the waves, releasing bombs that would walk across a moving target with devastating accuracy. The system had a designation that revealed nothing: RC-17, Low Altitude Bomb Sight, LAB for short. But the men who used it had a different name for what they did. They called themselves the Snoopers, and on this night, they were about to demonstrate to the Imperial Japanese Navy that darkness no longer provided any sanctuary at all. The journey to this technological revolution had begun 2 years earlier, not in a laboratory or engineering facility, but in the desperate tactical realities of the Pacific War. By mid-1942, the United States Navy and Army Air Forces faced a problem that threatened to undermine the entire island-hopping strategy across the Pacific. Japanese convoys were resupplying their garrisons with impunity. American bombers attempting to attack these convoys from medium and high altitude were achieving hit rates that approached statistical irrelevance. The B-17 flying fortresses, bombing from 15,000 to 20,000 feet, were hitting less than 1% of their targets. Ships had time to maneuver. Weather obscured targets. The mathematical problem of hitting a moving vessel from high altitude while accounting for wind, altitude, airspeed, and the target's velocity proved effectively unsolvable under combat conditions. The Norden bomb sight, which had been developed through the 1930s and produced at enormous cost, had demonstrated in peacetime testing the ability to achieve a circular error probable of 75 feet. In theory, this precision should have enabled attacks on point targets like ships. In practice, combat conditions destroyed that theoretical accuracy. By 1943, the average circular error probable in European operations was 1,200 feet. A ship moving at 20 knots could travel more than 300 feet in the 10 seconds it took a bomb to fall from 15,000 feet. The target had moved before the bomb arrived. Anti-aircraft fire disrupted bombing runs. Clouds obscured targets at the critical moment. Evasive maneuvering by ships made the problem exponentially worse. The solution that emerged was not to bomb from higher altitude with better sights. The solution was to abandon high-altitude bombing of ships entirely, and instead attack at altitudes so low that the time of flight for the bombs became negligible. Skip bombing, pioneered in the Southwest Pacific, involved approaching ships at mast height, typically 50 to 200 feet above the water, and releasing bombs that would skip across the surface like stones before slamming into the hull at or below the waterline. This technique had proven devastatingly effective during the Battle of the Bismarck Sea in March 1943, when modified B-25 Mitchell bombers destroyed an entire Japanese convoy. But skip bombing had one critical limitation. It required visual identification of the target. It could only be employed during daylight and in weather conditions with adequate visibility. Japanese convoys quickly adapted by moving at night or during periods of poor weather. They exploited the monsoon season in Southeast Asia and the frequent storms of the Western Pacific to shield their movements. If American forces could not see the ships, they could not attack them, regardless of how effective their tactics might be in clear conditions. The technological answer to this problem emerged from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology Radiation Laboratory, where some of the most brilliant scientists and engineers in America had been assembled to develop radar systems for military applications. Radar could see through darkness and weather. Radar could detect ships at ranges of 50 to 70 miles. But radar alone was not sufficient. The challenge was to marry radar detection with bombing accuracy. A bombardier needed to see his target on radar, track it, calculate the proper release point, while accounting for the target's motion. The bomber's motion, altitude, airspeed, and wind, and then release bombs at precisely the correct instant while flying at extremely low altitude, where any error in pilot technique or timing would result in complete mission failure or the aircraft impacting the water. In early 1943, a small team at the Radiation Laboratory began working on a system that would integrate search radar with bomb sight technology. The concept was elegant in its simplicity, but extraordinarily complex in its execution. A large search radar, the SCR-717, operating at 10 cm wavelength, would detect targets at extended range. Once a target was identified, the bombardier would use a modified Norden bomb sight that had been adapted to accept radar input rather than visual input. The radar image would be displayed on a small scope in the bombardier's position. The bombardier would center crosshairs on the target blip on his scope. The computer would continuously calculate the proper release point based on altitude, indicated by a radio altimeter, airspeed, wind drift, and the ballistic characteristics of the bombs being carried. The system would automatically release the bombs through an intervalometer at the computed instant, spacing them at 75-foot intervals, to create a pattern that would walk across the target. The beauty of the system was that it functioned identically, whether the target was visible or invisible, whether it was daylight or darkness, whether the weather was clear or the bomber was flying through the heart of a typhoon. The radar saw everything. The computer calculated everything. The bombardier simply had to keep the crosshairs centered on the target blip as the bomber made its attack run at 100 feet above the water at 135 knots indicated airspeed. The challenges in developing this system were formidable. The analog computer had to perform continuous ballistic calculations accurately and quickly enough to account for changing conditions during the attack run. The radar had to provide sufficient resolution to distinguish individual ships in a convoy. The intervalometer had to release bombs at precisely the correct intervals. The radio altimeter had to maintain accurate altitude indication at extremely low levels, where ground effect and sea state could introduce errors. And all of this equipment had to function reliably in the vibration, temperature extremes, and humidity of tropical combat operations. By late 1943, working prototypes existed. The system had been tested at Langley Field in Virginia under conditions of absolute secrecy. Crews were trained with blacked-out nose compartments, learning to bomb using only their radar displays, even though the actual training flights occurred in daylight over the Chesapeake Bay. The bombardiers learned to interpret radar images, to distinguish between different types of targets, to compensate for sea return that cluttered their displays, to track moving targets and to trust their instruments absolutely. The security surrounding the LAB system was extraordinary. Crew members were ordered never to discuss their training with anyone outside the program. The radar sets and associated equipment were transported in sealed containers. When the first operational units deployed to the Pacific in August 1943, they carried orders that forbade any mention of their true mission or capabilities. The officer selected to lead this experimental unit was Colonel Stuart Wright, a career Army Air Force officer who understood both the potential and the risks of introducing untested technology into combat operations. Wright was given 10 specially modified B-24D Liberators, designated SB-24 seconds to indicate their special mission configuration. Each aircraft had been fitted with the SCR-717 search radar, the modified Norden bomb sight, the RC-17 computer, radio altimeter, and all associated systems. The radar operator's position was in the waist of the aircraft, where the large search radar scope provided a comprehensive view of everything within range. The Bombardier in the nose had his small precision scope slaved to the bombsight computer. Wright hand-picked his crews. He needed pilots with exceptional low-altitude flying skills who could maintain precise altitude and airspeed during long attack runs in darkness and weather. He needed bombardiers who could interpret radar images quickly and accurately under stress. He needed radar operators who understood the equipment intimately and could coax maximum performance from finicky vacuum tube electronics. He needed navigators who could position the aircraft in vast expanses of ocean with nothing but dead reckoning and celestial navigation. Every position demanded excellence because any failure would result in mission failure or loss of the aircraft and crew. The unit was initially designated the 394th Bombardment Squadron of the 5th Bomb Group, but this administrative convenience was quickly abandoned. The specialized nature of their mission and the independent operations they would conduct made attachment to a standard bomb group impractical. They would eventually become the 868th Bombardment Squadron, the Snoopers, operating independently and frequently flying single aircraft missions deep into enemy-controlled waters. In August 1943, Wright's 10 crews departed Langley Field for the Pacific Theater. They were assigned to the 13th Air Force, which was engaged in the Solomon Islands campaign. Their arrival at Henderson Field on Guadalcanal in September 1943 coincided with intense operations against Japanese shipping and installations throughout the Solomon and Bismarck Islands. The Japanese were attempting to reinforce and resupply their garrisons. American forces were attempting to isolate those garrisons by interdicting the supply lines. The stage was set for the B-24 seconds to prove their worth. The first operational mission occurred on the night of October 24, 1943. Naval intelligence had detected a Japanese convoy moving down the Slot, the sea passage from Bougainville Island through New Georgia Sound toward Guadalcanal. The convoy consisted of fast transports escorted by destroyers. Under normal circumstances, such a convoy would have been attacked by day bombers and torpedo aircraft, but the weather was deteriorating, with heavy squalls and low visibility predicted throughout the night. Wright decided this was the perfect opportunity to demonstrate what his radar-equipped bombers could accomplish. Captain Franklin Reynolds, flying the B-24 Coral Princess, was selected to lead the attack. Reynolds and his crew had excelled during training. His Bombardier had consistently achieved excellent results during practice runs. His radar operator was among the best in the unit. Reynolds himself was an exceptionally skilled pilot who had demonstrated the ability to maintain precise control at low altitude in all weather conditions. The mission brief was straightforward. Take off after dark. Fly to the suspected convoy location. Use the search radar to locate the targets. Execute low-altitude bombing attacks against the largest vessels. Assess results and return to base. Simple in concept, extraordinarily demanding in execution. Reynolds lifted off into a black sky with rain already beginning to fall. The B-24 climbed to 3,000 feet, the altitude where the search radar achieved maximum range. The radar operator, hunched over his scope in the waist of the aircraft, began sweeping the area where intelligence predicted the convoy would be. For 30 minutes, the scope showed nothing but sea return and weather clutter. Then, faint contacts appeared at the edge of the display. As the B-24 closed the range, the contacts strengthened and resolved into individual blips. 11 ships. Reynolds circled at a distance, maintaining radar contact while his crew analyzed the formation. They identified the largest vessel, a cargo transport. This would be their target. Reynolds began his descent, dropping gradually while keeping the target at maximum radar range. This technique prevented the Japanese from detecting the approaching bomber on their own less sophisticated radar systems until it was too late to react effectively. At 1,000 feet altitude and 135 knots indicated airspeed, Reynolds steadied the aircraft on its final attack heading. In the nose, his Bombardier had centered the crosshairs of his radar scope on the transport. The RC-17 computer was calculating continuously. The radio altimeter showed altitude decreasing as Reynolds descended to 100 feet. The intervalometer was set for 75-foot spacing. 6 500-pound general-purpose bombs were loaded in the bomb bay with 5-second delay fuses. The attack run lasted approximately 30 seconds from final heading to bomb release. At 100 feet above the black water, flying at 135 knots, in complete darkness, through rain, Reynolds held the aircraft absolutely steady while his Bombardier tracked the target. When the computer determined the precise release point, the intervalometer automatically triggered. 6 bombs dropped away in rapid sequence. The B-24 climbed immediately to avoid the blast effects. Behind them, unseen but detected on the radar display, the bombs impacted. The spacing was perfect. 2 bombs struck the transport directly. 4 were near misses, close enough to cause significant damage through underwater shock. Fires erupted on the vessel. Secondary explosions followed as cargo ignited. The transport was mortally wounded. Reynolds radioed the results back to other SB-24 seconds that were inbound to the target area. His transmission served as a homing beacon. Lieutenant John Zinn in Uncle's Fury arrived next and attacked a destroyer, though anti-aircraft fire had intensified significantly as the Japanese realized they were under attack. Other crews followed throughout the night, each selecting targets, executing their attack runs, and then climbing away into the protective darkness. By dawn, when Navy reconnaissance aircraft flew over the area, 1 transport had sunk. 2 others were severely damaged and would be sunk by follow-up strikes. A destroyer had been damaged badly enough that it was later scuttled. The cost, too. American forces was 0. Not a single SB-24 had been hit by anti-aircraft fire. The attack had been conducted in weather that would have made conventional bombing impossible. The Japanese had been given a glimpse of a new form of warfare, where darkness and weather no longer provided protection. The success of this first mission validated the entire concept. Colonel Wright immediately began planning expanded operations. His crews flew missions every night that intelligence indicated worthwhile targets. They ranged across vast expanses of the Pacific, attacking convoys, isolated ships, harbor installations, anything that could be detected on radar and destroyed with bombs. The snoopers developed tactics and techniques through experience. They learned that approaching from upwind minimized the sound signature until the final attack run. They learned that varying altitude during the approach confused Japanese radar operators. They learned that attacking during weather fronts, when Japanese ships assumed they were safe, produced the highest success rates. The operational pattern that emerged was demanding and dangerous. Crews would receive intelligence briefings in late afternoon indicating suspected Japanese movements. They would take off after dark, fly 3 to 5 hours to the target area, locate targets using radar, execute attacks at extremely low altitude, and return to base, frequently landing just before dawn. The missions required continuous concentration for 8 to 10 hours. Navigational errors could result in becoming lost over the Pacific, with insufficient fuel to reach base. Equipment failures could leave a crew unable to locate targets or unable to attack even if they found them. Pilot error at 100 feet altitude was instantly fatal. The margin for error was 0. Yet the crews of the 868th Bombardment Squadron flew these missions night after night through late 1943 and into 1944. They sank cargo ships, transports, destroyers, and smaller vessels. They attacked harbour facilities at Rabaul, Kavieng, and other major Japanese bases. They provided radar reconnaissance, reporting ship movements and locations that guided other strike forces. They became the most effective anti-shipping unit in the Pacific, achieving results that far exceeded their small numbers. One mission in particular demonstrated both the capabilities of the lab system and the skill of the crews who employed it. On the night of November 2nd, 1943, naval intelligence reported a major Japanese naval force moving south from Rabaul to bombard American positions on Bougainville. The force included heavy cruisers, light cruisers, and destroyers. This was not a convoy of transports. This was a powerful warship formation that could devastate American positions if it reached Bougainville. 3 B-24 seconds were available for operations that night. They launched in darkness and flew north toward the suspected position of the Japanese force. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The search radars picked up numerous contacts. The targets were not slow-moving transports. These ships were making 25 to 30 knots, maneuvering in formation, maintaining anti-aircraft watches. They were the most dangerous targets the snoopers had yet encountered. The lead aircraft, commanded by a pilot whose reflexes and skill had been proven through dozens of missions, selected the largest radar return, a heavy cruiser. The attack run was executed perfectly. Bombs walked across the cruiser's stern. Fires erupted. The cruiser's speed dropped as flooding and damage affected its engineering spaces. But the return fire from the formation was intense and accurate. The SB-24 climbed away with damage from anti-aircraft fragments. The other 2 aircraft attacked different targets with varying success. One made multiple bomb runs against a cruiser, scoring hits on each pass. The pilot and crew demonstrated extraordinary courage by returning repeatedly to a fully alerted target, putting out massive volumes of anti-aircraft fire. Another aircraft attacked a destroyer and missed, the bombs falling just short as the target maneuvered violently during the final seconds of the attack run. The 3 SB-24 seconds returned to base with battle damage but no casualties. Behind them, the Japanese force had been scattered and damaged. More importantly, American Navy surface forces now knew the exact location, composition, course, and speed of the enemy formation. Surface action was joined hours later in what became known as the Battle of Empress Augusta Bay. The Japanese force was defeated decisively, losing a light cruiser sunk and multiple ships damaged. The American victory was secured in part because the SB-24 seconds had located the Japanese force, reported its position, and inflicted early damage that disrupted its formation and timing. Admiral Thomas Kincaid, commander of Allied naval forces in the area, sent a message of thanks to the 13th Air Force for the splendid night tracking mission. That simple message represented recognition from the Navy that these Army Air Force crews, flying modified bombers with experimental equipment, had contributed meaningfully to a major naval victory. The snoopers had proven they could operate against warships, not just transports and cargo vessels. Through the closing months of 1943 and into the spring of 1944, the 868th Bombardment Squadron continued operations from advancing bases. As American forces pushed north through the Solomons and into the Bismarck Archipelago, the snoopers moved forward with them. They operated from Guadalcanal, then Munda, then Los Negros, always positioning themselves to cover the maximum area of Japanese-controlled waters. The toll on crews and aircraft was significant. 2 of the original 10 aircraft and crews were lost in the first months of operations. 1 crew was lost when their aircraft was hit by anti-aircraft fire during a low-level attack and crashed into the sea. Another was lost when electrical problems during a storm led to the aircraft flying into the water while attempting to maintain altitude in severe turbulence. Every loss was devastating to a small unit. Each aircraft represented millions of dollars of equipment and thousands of hours of training. Each crew represented men who could not be easily replaced because the skills and experience required were so specialized. Yet replacements arrived. The program expanded. Additional crews were trained at Langley Field and deployed to the Pacific. The unit grew from 10 aircraft to 15, then 20. The missions continued without pause. Japanese shipping losses mounted. Supply lines were severed. Garrisons withered. The night no longer provided sanctuary. The monsoon no longer protected convoys. Japanese merchantmen and warships learned to fear the sound of a single aircraft circling in the darkness. Above them, invisible but deadly, guided by systems they did not fully understand and could not effectively counter. The LAB system was not without limitations. The radar could not distinguish between friendly and enemy vessels without additional information from identification friend or foe systems. Several missions were aborted when IFF interrogation indicated that suspected targets were actually American ships. The early IFF systems were unreliable, sometimes giving false readings that resulted in crews aborting attacks against legitimate Japanese targets because they could not be certain of identification. The computing bomb site required constant maintenance. Vacuum tubes failed. Mechanical components wore or broke. Calibration drifted. Every aircraft had a maintenance crew that worked frantically between missions to keep the systems operational. Bombardiers and radar operators became expert at field repairs and adjustments. They learned which vacuum tubes failed most frequently and kept spares readily available. They learned to compensate for equipment limitations through technique and experience. The weather in the Pacific Theater created unique challenges for the LAB system. High humidity caused electrical problems. Salt spray corroded connections. Tropical heat made the cramped crew positions unbearable during long missions. Thunderstorms generated electromagnetic interference that cluttered radar displays. Typhoons grounded operations entirely. The maintenance crews working on the B-24s fought a constant battle against environmental degradation of sensitive electronic equipment that had been designed for temperate conditions but was being operated in the worst tropical environment imaginable. Despite these challenges, the operational tempo remained intense through early 1944. The snoopers were providing capabilities that no other unit could match. Intelligence would identify Japanese shipping movements. The 868th would launch that night. Targets would be found, attacked, damaged, or sunk. By dawn, reconnaissance would confirm results, and naval intelligence would update their assessment of Japanese capabilities and intentions. The cycle would repeat the following night. As word of the LAB system's success spread through the Army Air Force, other commanders began requesting similar capabilities for their theaters. General Claire Chennault, commanding the 14th Air Force in China, faced a particular challenge. Japanese shipping in the South China Sea was supplying enemy forces throughout southern China, French Indochina, and Southeast Asia. The Imperial Japanese Navy was using the Formosa Strait to move both commercial and naval vessels between the home islands and occupied territories. Chennault had been sending conventionally armed B-25 Mitchells and B-24 Liberators from forward bases in eastern China to attack these convoys, but intense anti-aircraft fire from well-protected warships had prevented his forces from sinking anything larger than supply vessels. In early 1944, Chennault submitted an urgent request for LAB-equipped B-24s. The first aircraft, piloted by Lieutenant William Cashmore, arrived in Kunming, China, in April 1944. Several other crews followed in late April and May. One of these crews was led by Lieutenant Jay LeVan of Stroudsburg, Pennsylvania. LeVan was 23 years old, a skilled pilot who had been selected for the LAB program because of his demonstrated ability to maintain precise aircraft control under demanding conditions. His bombardier was Lieutenant William Shytle, who had excelled during training at Langley Field and had proven equally capable during combat operations after deployment. The LAB crews in China operated from forward bases at Guilin and Luichao, primitive facilities that had been carved from the Chinese countryside with nothing but hand labor. The living conditions were brutal. Muddy slit, trenches served as air raid shelters. Makeshift wooden barracks were perpetually damp with mildew. Food was limited and often questionable. Medical facilities were rudimentary. Japanese bombers attacked both bases regularly, forcing crews to take cover in cold mud and rainwater every few nights. But the operational opportunities were extraordinary. The South China Sea was crowded with Japanese shipping. Convoys moved constantly between ports. Major warships transited the area regularly. The targets were numerous and valuable. The challenge was finding them in the vast expanse of ocean and attacking them successfully despite increasingly alert defenses, as the Japanese became aware that American bombers were somehow locating and attacking ships at night. Lieutenant Cashmore's crew achieved the first success, sinking several supply ships during missions in May and June 1944. But these were relatively small vessels. The true test of the LAB system would come when it was employed against a major warship, a target that could defend itself effectively and whose loss would represent a significant blow to Japanese naval capabilities. That opportunity arrived on the night of August 19th, 1944. Intelligence reported a Japanese heavy cruiser operating in the South China Sea off the coast of southern China. The cruiser was moving supplies and probably conducting anti-shipping patrols against Chinese coastal vessels. Weather in the area was terrible. A monsoon system had moved through, bringing heavy rain, low visibility, and rough seas. The Japanese captain likely believed he was completely safe from air attack under these conditions. Lieutenant LeVan and his crew were assigned the mission. They took off from Luichao in late afternoon, flying south and east toward the reported position of the cruiser. The weather was as bad as predicted. Rain hammered the aircraft. Visibility was zero. LeVan climbed to 3,000 feet to clear the worst of the turbulence, while his radar operator began searching for contacts. The search radar detected the cruiser at a range of approximately 40 miles. The radar return was strong and distinct. This was a large ship. LeVan turned toward the contact and began his descent, maintaining radar contact while gradually reducing altitude. The approach was textbook. Descend slowly. Keep the target at maximum range to avoid detection. Time the final attack run to minimize exposure to anti-aircraft fire. At 1,000 feet altitude, LeVan steadied on the attack heading. The cruiser was approximately 5 miles ahead, still invisible in the rain and darkness. Bombardier Shytle had the target centered in his radar scope. The RC-17 computer was performing its continuous calculations. At 100 feet above the waves, flying through rain so heavy that the windscreen was completely obscured, LeVan held the B-24 absolutely steady. The bombs released automatically. 6 500-pound bombs spaced at 75-foot intervals. The B-24 climbed immediately. Behind them, invisible but tracked on radar, the bombs struck. 2 direct hits on the cruiser. The radar return showed the ship's speed decreasing. Then LeVan did something that demonstrated either exceptional courage or reckless disregard for danger. He circled back for a second attack. The cruiser had not yet begun firing its anti-aircraft weapons during the first attack, likely because the crew had been taken completely by surprise by bombs appearing from nowhere in the middle of a rainstorm. But now the ship was alert. Every gun that could be brought to bear would be firing on the next run. LeVan made his second approach at 1,000 feet altitude, slightly higher than standard to provide a margin of safety. Shytle achieved another direct hit. The cruiser was now burning and severely damaged. LeVan circled out to a safe distance and called his crew together over the intercom. They held a brief conference and decided to make a third attack. They had bombs remaining. The cruiser, while damaged, was still operational. They would press the attack until either the ship sank or their bombs were exhausted. This decision violated standard operating procedures that called for a single attack run followed by immediate withdrawal. But LeVan and his crew had seen an opportunity to sink a major Japanese warship, and they were determined to complete the mission regardless of risk. The third attack run was the most dangerous. The cruiser was now fully alert and firing everything. But the combination of darkness, weather, and the extremely low altitude of the attacking aircraft made accurate anti-aircraft fire nearly impossible. Shytle put more bombs into the cruiser. By the time LeVan turned away after the third attack, the cruiser was dead in the water, burning fiercely, clearly doomed. LeVan and his crew returned to Luichao and reported sinking a Japanese warship. Intelligence analysis later confirmed that the cruiser was the heavy cruiser Oi, 5,100 tons displacement, 550 feet long, armed with multiple 5-inch guns and torpedo tubes. The ship had been sunk by 3 low-altitude bombing attacks executed in complete darkness during a rainstorm by a single B-24 using a radar bombing system that the Japanese had not known existed. The sinking of the Oi represented the high point of LAB operations. A single aircraft had located, attacked, and destroyed a major Japanese warship under conditions that made conventional attack impossible. The mission demonstrated conclusively that the LAB system could accomplish what its designers had intended. It could find targets in darkness and weather. It could attack with accuracy at extremely low altitude, and it could inflict devastating damage on even the most heavily defended targets. For this action, both LeVan and Shytle received the Distinguished Flying Cross. The citation specifically noted the exceptional skill and courage demonstrated during repeated attacks against a heavily armed warship, but the recognition extended beyond these two men. Every crew member aboard that aircraft contributed to the success: the radar operator, who maintained contact throughout the attacks; the navigator, who positioned the aircraft precisely; the engineer, who kept the engines running smoothly; the radio operator, who maintained communication. Success in these missions required excellence from every member of the crew. The LAB system saw continued service through the remainder of 1944 and into 1945. As the war progressed and American forces advanced across the Pacific, the snoopers moved forward with the front lines. They operated from Morotai, then from bases in the Philippines. The missions changed in character as Japanese shipping became increasingly scarce. With Allied submarines, mines, and air attacks having devastated the Japanese merchant marine, there were fewer targets to find. The B-24s increasingly flew reconnaissance missions, searching vast expanses of ocean and reporting anything they detected. But when targets appeared, the snoopers attacked with the same precision and lethality they had demonstrated since their first operational mission. Through the closing months of the war, they continued to sink ships, attack harbour installations, and provide intelligence that guided larger strike forces. Their operational record was extraordinary. In nearly 2 years of combat operations, the 868th Bombardment Squadron had sunk or damaged hundreds of Japanese vessels, ranging from small cargo ships to major warships. The cost had been significant. By war's end, the unit had lost approximately 20% of its aircraft and crews. Some losses were combat-related: aircraft shot down by anti-aircraft fire or destroyed by Japanese fighters during the vulnerable moments after attacking a target. Other losses resulted from operational accidents inherent to flying complex aircraft at extremely low altitude in darkness and weather. Navigation errors, mechanical failures, severe weather, and simple pilot error claimed aircraft and crews. Flying the missions demanded by the LAB system was inherently dangerous. The men who flew them accepted that risk because they understood the importance of their mission and the unique capabilities they provided. The technological significance of the LAB system extended far beyond its immediate tactical success. It represented one of the first practical applications of integrated radar and computer technology for weapons delivery. The concept of using sensors and computation to attack targets beyond visual range would become fundamental to post-war military aviation. Modern strike aircraft employ descendants of the principles first proven by the LAB system, though the technology has advanced from vacuum tubes and mechanical computers to solid-state electronics and digital processors. The LAB system also demonstrated the value of night and all-weather attack capabilities. Prior to its deployment, air forces were largely limited to daylight operations in reasonable weather. Darkness and bad weather provided sanctuary to targets. The LAB system shattered that sanctuary. It proved that technology could extend operational capabilities into conditions that had previously prevented effective combat. This lesson influenced post-war development of radar, infrared, and other sensors that allowed aircraft to operate effectively in all conditions. The operational concept pioneered by the snoopers, single aircraft operating independently at night against high-value targets using advanced sensors and precision weapons, became a template for special operations aviation. Modern gunships and special mission aircraft trace their conceptual lineage directly to the B-24s that prowled the Pacific darkness seeking Japanese ships. The willingness to operate alone, far from support, relying on technology and crew skill, became a hallmark of elite aviation units. The individuals who developed and employed the LAB system deserved recognition that they rarely received. The secrecy that surrounded the program during the war continued after the war. The technological details remained classified for decades. The operational history of the 868th Bombardment Squadron was not widely known. The men who had flown these dangerous missions returned to civilian life without the public recognition given to fighter aces or bomber crews who had flown daylight missions over Europe or Japan. Yet their contribution to Allied victory was substantial and undeniable. They had developed tactics and techniques that proved radar bombing was practical and effective. They had located and destroyed hundreds of enemy ships, severing supply lines and isolating Japanese garrisons. They had provided reconnaissance that guided naval forces and other air units. They had proven that technological innovation, properly applied, could create decisive military advantages. They had demonstrated that courage and skill could overcome the limitations of equipment and the dangers of impossible missions. Colonel Stuart Wright, who had led the program from its inception, later reflected on what his crews had accomplished. He noted that of the 10 original aircraft and crews that deployed to the Pacific in August 1943, only a handful survived to see the war's end. Some had been lost in combat, some had been lost to accidents, some had completed their tours and rotated home. But every one of them had contributed to proving that the LAB system worked. They had written the tactics manual. They had identified and solved problems. They had shown follow-on crews how to survive and succeed. Their legacy was measured not just in ships sunk, but in the knowledge they created about how to employ radar bombing effectively. The development of the LAB system represented a particular kind of innovation that characterized American military technology during World War II. It combined existing technologies, the Norden bomb sight and radar, in novel ways to create new capabilities. It was driven by operational necessity, the need to attack ships at night. It was developed quickly, from concept to combat deployment in less than 18 months. It was implemented by small teams of specialists rather than through massive industrial programs, and it was refined through combat experience rather than prolonged testing. This pattern of innovation, identifying operational problems, developing technological solutions, fielding them quickly, and improving them through operational experience, would become standard practice in American military development. The willingness to experiment, to accept risk, to trust small teams of skilled personnel with complex equipment and dangerous missions, produced results that more conservative approaches could never have achieved. The LAB system succeeded because men like Colonel Wright were willing to advocate for it, because bombardiers like Lieutenant Shytle mastered its complexities, because pilots like Lieutenant LeVan flew it into harm's way, and because maintenance crews kept it working despite impossible conditions. When the war ended in August 1945, the LAB system was already being superseded by more advanced radar and computing systems. The B-29 Superfortress carried improved radar that provided better resolution and longer range. Jet aircraft were beginning to enter service, rendering the piston-engine B-24 obsolete. The atomic bomb had demonstrated that strategic bombing no longer required precision delivery of conventional explosives. The technological revolution continued, moving beyond the systems that had won World War II toward the weapons that would define the Cold War. But the lessons learned from the LAB system endured. The importance of all-weather, attack capability, the value of precision sensors integrated with computing systems, the effectiveness of small, highly trained units employing specialized equipment, the necessity of continuous innovation driven by operational experience. These principles, first proven by the snoopers in the darkness above the Pacific, remained relevant through subsequent conflicts and continue to influence military aviation today. The men who flew the B-24 seconds returned to civilian life after the war and rejoined a nation that was transforming rapidly from wartime mobilization to peacetime prosperity. Some remained in the military, serving through the Korean War and beyond, applying the experience they had gained to new challenges and new technologies. Most left military service, returned to their homes, and resumed the lives that had been interrupted by the war. They went back to farms and factories, offices and universities. They married, raised families, built careers. The war became a chapter in their past rather than the defining experience of their lives. Yet those who had been part of the LAB program carried knowledge that few others possessed. They had seen what was possible when technology and human skill combined to overcome what seemed impossible. They had learned that darkness was not absolute, that weather was not insurmountable, that moving targets could be hit with precision. They had discovered that courage and competence could prevail against fear and uncertainty. These lessons transcended the specific technology of radar bombing. They applied to any challenge where success required pushing beyond conventional limitations. The LAB system itself was retired as newer technologies emerged. The B-24 Liberators that had carried the system were scrapped or relegated to secondary roles. The SCR-717 radars and RC-17 computers were replaced by more sophisticated equipment. The vacuum tubes and mechanical components that had represented cutting-edge technology in 1943 seemed primitive by 1950. The rapid pace of technological advancement during and after World War II rendered even recent innovations obsolete within years rather than decades. But the fundamental achievement remained significant. In August 1943, attacking ships at night with precision was impossible. By August 1944, it was routine for the crews of the 868th Bombardment Squadron. That transformation occurred because engineers at MIT Radiation Laboratory conceived a solution, because the Army Air Force invested resources in developing it, because Colonel Wright organized and led the operational unit, and because the crews who flew the missions perfected the tactics and techniques that made it work. The story of the LAB system is ultimately a story about human capability expressed through technology. The radar could see through darkness. The computer could calculate ballistic trajectories. The intervalometer could release bombs at precise intervals. But none of this technology was useful without human operators who understood it, maintained it, and employed it effectively. The Bombardier who interpreted radar images and kept the crosshairs centered on the target. The pilot who maintained altitude and airspeed within narrow tolerances during the attack run. The radar operator who coaxed maximum performance from temperamental equipment. The navigator who positioned the aircraft in the vastness of the Pacific with nothing but celestial observations and dead reckoning. The maintenance crews who kept complex electronic systems functional in tropical heat and humidity. Technology provided the capability. Human skill and courage made it effective. This relationship between technology and the people who employ it has defined military aviation from its inception and continues to define it today. The most sophisticated equipment is worthless if the people operating it lack the training, experience, and determination to use it properly. Conversely, the most skilled and courageous personnel are limited by the capabilities of the equipment available to them. Success requires both excellent technology and excellent people, combined through effective doctrine and realistic training. The LAB system achieved this combination. It provided radar that could detect ships at extended range in all conditions. It provided a computing bomb sight that could calculate release points accurately. It provided crews who had been trained to employ the system effectively and who had proven through combat experience that they could execute missions successfully. The result was a dramatic expansion of American capabilities in the Pacific theater and a corresponding reduction in Japanese abilities to move supplies and reinforcements to their forces. As the last surviving veterans of the LAB program aged and passed away in the decades following the war, their story risked being forgotten. The classified nature of the program meant that few records were publicly available. The specialized nature of the missions meant that few people outside the unit understood what they had accomplished. The rapid technological advancement that made the LAB system obsolete also made it seem like ancient history. A curiosity from an era before computers and satellites and GPS made precision attack under all conditions routine. But the story deserves to be remembered. Not just as a technical achievement, though it certainly was that. Not just as a military success, though it unquestionably was that as well, but as an example of what can be accomplished when operational necessity drives innovation, when skilled people are given the resources and authority to solve problems, when risk is accepted in pursuit of breakthrough capabilities, and when courage and competence combine to achieve what initially seemed impossible. On that night of August 19th, 1944, when Lieutenant LeVan flew his B-24 through the monsoon darkness toward a Japanese cruiser, when Lieutenant Shytle tracked the target on his radar scope and guided bombs to impact, when those bombs struck the Oi and sent it to the bottom of the South China Sea, they were demonstrating something profound. They were proving that darkness no longer provided sanctuary, that weather no longer prevented attack, that technology, properly employed, could extend human capabilities beyond what was thought possible, that a single aircraft, properly equipped and flown by a skilled and determined crew, could sink a warship. The cruiser captain who believed the storm made him invincible was wrong. The Japanese naval officers who believed night movements were safe were wrong. The conventional wisdom that held that hitting moving ships from aircraft required visual contact was wrong. All of these assumptions were shattered by the reality of what the LAB system could accomplish. The radar saw through the darkness. The computer solved. The ballistics. The Bombardier put bombs on target. The pilot brought his crew home safely. The mission succeeded because technology and training and skill and courage all aligned at the critical moment. This was the gift that the men of the 868th Bombardment Squadron gave to their nation and to history. They proved that impossible missions could become routine operations. They demonstrated that technological innovation could create decisive military advantages. They showed that small units of highly trained specialists could accomplish what seemed beyond the capabilities of conventional forces. They established principles and precedents that would influence military aviation for generations to come. When the final official history of World War II in the Pacific is written, the LAB system and the snoopers who employed it deserve a prominent place. Not because they won the war single-handedly. No single weapon system or unit can make that claim. But because they represented something essential about how America fought and won that war. Innovation, driven by necessity, technology employed with skill, courage demonstrated through action, success achieved through excellence. These were the characteristics that defined the American military at its best during World War II, and the story of the LAB system exemplifies them all. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.